First, may I thank Dabok Community Support for the invitation to come and speak to you all. Today I'm going to speak about the work of the Community Shares Unit, which is a government-funded, UK government-funded agency to support the law reform, regulation and research and development into a new form of finance for community enterprises and social enterprises in the UK. We started out as a research program funded through the Prime Minister's office in 2009 under Prime Minister Gordon Brown, when we were invited to work with 10 communities on experimental projects looking at the methods that I'm going to talk about today. By 2012, when we had tested the ideas, we established a new research and development unit funded through the government. There is, you'll see up here that this is the department that funds us is the UK government's Department of Communities and Local Government. We're actually based, it's a joint initiative between two national community enterprise support organisations. The first one is Cooperatives UK, which is this body up here, and the other one is called Locality. Locality is a national community building organisation. It works directly with neighbourhoods and communities on developing responses to the problems that communities face. And what's important about today is that we're talking about direct investment by citizens in community enterprises that serve those communities, so that people become direct owners of those enterprises. I'm going to attempt to work with Korean slides, but I might have problems if I lose track, but I'll endeavour to stay on message. Okay, so when we started in 2009, what were the issues that we were trying to tackle? The first one, I mean, we already had imported ideas that Cliff Rosenthal spoke about on the opening day. Our Prime Minister Gordon Brown had been to the USA. He had imported ideas of CDFIs, and we had those established by the mid-2000s. So these were lending mechanisms for many social enterprises, and by then interest rates were already coming down. And the problem is, though, that many social enterprises, a bit like Mrs. Mercado's experience, were not taking up these loans. And it wasn't because they couldn't afford the interest payments. The problem often was more the length of the loan. And often with 5-year repayment periods, the interest rate payment was only a small, I mean, that was maybe 4 or 5%. But if you're repaying a loan over 5 years, then it's 20% of the capital has to be repaid every year. And that was a big problem for many social enterprises, that they didn't have the cash flow to be able to finance that. So if you think about, one of the things about this conference has been the great range of different types of social finance that we've been talking about. We've been talking about it for personal finance to help individuals, low-income individuals. And also we've been talking about enterprise finance, and today is very much about enterprise. How do we help stimulate enterprise? And if we think, what sort of funding does an enterprise need? Well, there are several different forms. There's grants and subsidies. There is loans and debt. There is the organisation making profits and keeping it in the business. And then there is equity or share investment. Now, the social enterprise world globally, it's looked at equity and said, oh, it's not possible. And the reason they say it's not possible is because people's understanding of equity is based on what is right for private companies. So this line here about, I think it's here, about it's for private benefit and for capital gain and for speculation to become rich. It is very profit orientated and wealth orientated. The purpose of capitalism is to maximize your wealth, which it doesn't fit with the ambitions and goals of social enterprise and community enterprise. and share capital is the mechanism through which wealth is accumulated. So people have said, no, it's not the right thing. But this has a lot to do with corporate law. It has to do with how company law is organized, and particularly the principles of one share, one vote. So you can have a majority shareholder who controls a business for their own benefit and at the cost of all other stakeholders. In the UK, like in many countries globally, we also have an alternative to this, though. We do have cooperative law, which is another body of corporate law. And this is what we turned our attention to look at, is it possible to use cooperative law to provide a new type of share capital? And when we started looking at this, and the UK government also looked at this in a big review in 2003, they said, well, it's a useful form of legislation, but it's not used much. By the time we started, there was only about 150 new cooperatives being registered each year. And they said that the legislation is very out of date. It's not been reformed enough. There's been that long-term decline in registration has been a critical part of that. Also, why did it decline? Well, we have, in the UK, we have a smaller number now of very large consumer cooperatives their finance is mainly from historic reserves, accumulated profits over the years. And they haven't had no appetite for raising new member capital. So they haven't been using the legislation. Also, the final point, and this is a very critical one when you think about trying to reach out to the public, to citizens, to invest directly in enterprises that serve them, is that it's not understood. People, as soon as you say equity finance, they go, oh no, I can't understand, I shut my ears to it, it's too complicated. You know, I'm only a simple person. So, and particularly the legislation used very old terms. The Act was called the Industrial and Provident Society Act. And even to an English person, that means nothing. It's old language. And the type of share capital is called withdrawable share capital. Again, people, as soon as you say this, just really don't understand it. So a big part of our program has been about trying to make this legislation, to reform it, but also to make it accessible, and particularly to reach out to ordinary people, because those were our targets for investing, not by governments, not by institutions, but by people taking ownership of enterprises that serve them, to engage people directly, and that's been a very, very important principle for us. Also, let me just compare, on the one hand, debt and equity. Now, the problem with debt is that, I've already explained, you have fixed terms. So not only the interest rate is fixed, regardless of how profitable or not the business is, but also the repayment term is fixed. Compare that with equity, which is a long-term investment. And maybe during today, I mean, you'll see that actually the type of equity that we have in this law, it's a strange hybrid between equity and debt. For those who understand this, you'll see how it has characteristics of both, but which make it perfect for the purposes of what we're doing. Another problem is that debt, for an enterprise, you have to go to an institution, to a lender, and it's their decision. So it creates an us and them attitude. With equity, you go to your members, your community make the decision whether to support you or not. So it's very much about us, not us and them, but just us. And it's a very empowering experience. And the us is reinforced by shared risk-taking, that we all share together in taking the risk of supporting this business. Of course, when you invest money in this, and it might be only a very small amount, if you engage large numbers of people in your community, the median investment, more than half the people will only invest a little amount of money, but it only takes a few to invest quite a bit for the average investment to be quite large. A lot of what I have to say is about money, but it's also about building communities. It's about bringing people together in communities to support the enterprises that serve their needs. And you know, when you become an owner, then you want to protect your investment. So you become a good customer, a good supporter, a volunteer, an activist, and these other roles, engaging everyone in the future of the community enterprise is a very important principle for us. So what have we achieved? Well, since 2009, we have been working to create what we call a social brand. A lot of what we do is about open source, non-copyrighted materials and ideas, particularly with community shares. The word, when you used to say withdrawable share capital, people would look puzzled. But when you say community shares, they go, maybe it has something to do with me. Maybe it is something I can do. We have worked with the government under Prime Minister David Cameron. We have now had law reform, and the Act, for instance, there's been much law reform, and the new Act is now called the Cooperative and Community Benefit Society Act, which means a little bit more to people. They understand what it is about. Since we've got going in 2009, we have seen over 700 new enterprises registered using this particular legal form, and nearly 400 of those have got to the point now of making a share offer, a public share offer. And you'll see later on that this takes quite a lot of work on behalf of the enterprise in preparation. So far, the money raised from the public from citizens has totaled over 110 million pounds. That's 155 billion won. Actually, before Brexit, I think you might have all have heard of Brexit, it was much more. It was 190 billion won, but now the pound has gone down in value. So far, across the country, we have engaged at least 100,000 people who have become members and shareholders in the enterprises that serve them. And now the community share societies make up 80% of all new registrations of societies in the UK. So I've said that a lot of our work is actually, as well as doing law reform, a big part of our work is about public education, trying to make the ideas popular. So I'm going to show you a short animation which we have on our main website and is used to help communicate to the public what the idea is. So I'm going to just move it on. I think, do I press twice? I hope.
Once upon a time, there was a community that didn't want the last pub where they lived to close down. They had great ideas about how it could be much more than a pub, but they needed money to make their dreams come true. The banks didn't think the community could make it work, and the local council didn't have any money to spare. But there was a group of people who did believe in them. Themselves. If they all pulled together, they could pool their money, from the well-off to the not-so-well-off. More than 200 enterprises in the UK have raised finance this way. From football clubs to piers, wind farms and local transport. What links them all is they respond to a need a community wants to see fulfilled. More than 40,000 people have already invested this way, often from as little as £50, but have raised amounts from £20,000 to more than 1.5 million. All this money was raised through people buying shares. But these weren't ordinary shares. They were community shares. Community shares don't work like normal shares, where you might be allowed to sell your shares to someone else. And your investment isn't a donation made in the hope that things will work out. At the heart of a community share issue is a business plan and offer document that shows how the money being raised will enable good things to happen. Your money will be backing something that has a real chance of success as a viable business. And when a community backs an idea by investing, it makes it more likely that other people will too. And the more successful the enterprise is, the more likely it is that people will get their money back. You might even get interest on your shares and a tax break on your investment. Regardless of how much you invest, you all have one vote. That means you and the other investors control the enterprise. And if you think it's being run badly, you can do something about it. Sharing ownership with others means you share the risk and the benefits. We're helping enterprises, supporters, and advisors to use community shares. And communities can even run their share offer directly through our Microgenius platform. So if your community believes in something, then investing in community shares can make it happen.
Okay, so that's, by the way, the figures in that are a bit out of date because it was made about 2 years ago, the animation. So let me just explain what community shares actually are and the key characteristics of them. The first and most important one is that it enables everyone to become a member. Regardless of how much money you have to invest, you can become a member and an owner of the business. So first of all, it's an important way of having community ownership. It goes beyond saying this enterprise serves you. It's saying this enterprise is yours. The second thing is about the function. Oops, sorry. The second thing is about the nature of the capital. These are not like shares in a company that are transferable and traded on a stock market. It's called withdrawable share capital. So when you want your money back, the enterprise is obliged to refund you. This, I mean, for a company to be on a stock market, you have to be a very large company. So it's a good way. If you have a small company with shares owned by many people, it wouldn't work. So this really resolves a big problem about share capital in a small enterprise being owned by lots of people, is that it provides liquidity for the investor. There is an exit route for them provided by the withdrawability. However, that creates a new obligation on the enterprise, is to make provisions for this withdrawal. And I can discuss in more detail exactly how that is done. Another very, very important feature is that this is democratic share capital. So no matter how many shares you buy, and there are limitations on this, there is a limit of how much one person can buy, you still only get one vote. So if you invest £5 or 500, 1,000 won, or 1,000,000 won, or 1,000,000,000 won, you still only get one vote. Also, you can get a return on this capital, but it's limited. So you can get, any return is paid as interest on your share capital, and it's at a limited and restricted amount. And then finally, because the shares cannot be traded, it's non-speculative. You don't have crazy share price loops. The share value remains at par. It can go down, but it can't go up and down according to speculation on the stock market. And if the business is wound up, the assets can't be distributed to shareholders. So any residual assets have to go into other social enterprises or community enterprises. Now, one of the things I've been doing is looking at the new Framework Act in Korea, and I think by and large your cooperative legislation here allows you to do a similar sort of equity. There may be some small adjustments required, but I think you have a similar legal base on which to build a similar form of share capital. So that's the theory. Let me just show you a few examples of practice. The first one is a thing that's very, it was one of our 10 original projects, and this is I'm sure you have all heard, if you followed the UK soccer, there's a famous club called Manchester United FC. In 2005, this was bought by an American billionaire called Glazier, whose first action was to increase ticket prices by 50%. And the fans were very angry because for them, Manchester United is their heart. If they win, they are very happy. If they lose, it's terrible. It is a very strong part of their identity. And for an American who's never seen a soccer match in his life, to come and take ownership was a terrible thing. So they said, that's it, we've had enough. We are creating our own community-owned club. And they started 11 years ago. Soccer is very popular in the UK. There are 250,000 football teams and in a very big pyramidal league system. And they started at the bottom of the league. Over the last 7 years, they have got now to be in the top 500 of teams. And they wanted to build a stadium. They have now achieved this goal. Their stadium cost them 6 billion won, but a large part of that, 2.8 billion won, was raised from their supporters and members. They have over 1,500 members who provide the
마무리
capital.
부탁드립니다.
Yeah, okay. There are more stories like this. I could go into, some of these are very close to my heart. There's another project, Hastings Pier, which was again a pier where it's a tourist centre that had gone into decline, had been popular in the 1960s, very big bands like The Who, Pink Floyd had played at, but private owners had run it into the ground, and eventually it was burnt down and abandoned. And there the community said, no, we want to restore it. And again, they raised capital to do this, but only actually a small part. The whole project cost over 20 billion won. The community raised 1.3 billion won. But that gave the confidence to public funders to back a project which originally everybody said is not possible to do. There are more projects. Here are a few in Scotland. This is a prisoner of war camp a prisoner of war camp that has been renovated as a tourist accommodation, and people who are interested in the history of the Second World War. Here, this is Port Patrick is a small, remote community in Scotland who the harbour was owned by a private individual who wasn't making anything of it, so they bought the harbour from the owner and raised capital for that purpose. Do Koreans like whiskey? This project here is Glenwivis whiskey distillery in an area of Scotland that doesn't normally make whiskey, and their local community raised 3.6 billion won to build a distillery and to act as a tourist attraction to create jobs locally. So over the years, this next chart's showing you the growth. There actually has always been, because the law has always existed, there's been, prior to 2009, there was about 5 or 6 new examples of this each year. So we had the basis of some examples to look at, but you can see the effect of the work that we've been doing is to grow the numbers. In 2014, the reason we have a dip here in 2014 in registrations was because that's the year the new Act came into power, and people were waiting for the new Act to become legislated. This shows you the number of share offers. So usually it takes a group anywhere between 6 months and 6 years from registration to get to the point where they're ready to make a public offer to recruit members and to raise capital. So they have to do business planning, they have to do a lot of community engagement work, they have to get their governance model right, and that's really where it explains the numbers. We can see a steady rise in these registrations, and this next slide just shows you the totals amounts raised each year and targeted. Again, there's a lag between in the data, in that we tend to know when people have made a share offer, we collect that data. It's not until they finally file their accounts that we know how much they've actually raised. So there's usually a 2-year lag between the data. So the years like 2011 and 12, we have accurate data there. This is based on reported amounts and amounts that we've known so far, but not until those enterprises file their accounts do we know the actual figures. of their success. So what does the Community Shares Unit do? Well, there's really four main things that we do. First of all, through our activities in market development and market intelligence, we promote the ideas to the public. And we do this by pointing to good examples of people who've been successful, and to create big stories like the Manchester United story, like the Hastings Pier story. And we then convert that into a handbook, a practitioner's handbook of how do you do this, to explain what is good practice and make it clear to that. We've also been training and licensing 100 professional practitioners and how to support communities who want to go down this route. And then finally, more recently, in the last year, we've introduced a standard mark, a certification process to say that this is a good offer. And there are four key pillars to what we do. The most important, I mean, although this sounds like it's all about money, actually, it's all about community engagement. That's the most important part of this, is building community support for your enterprise ideas. Governance is another important part, and really the key to this is not only the legal form, but the leadership, the democratic leadership, giving communities the confidence and skills to have a board of directors who are elected by the community and who have to stand or fall by their own decisions. Strong business modeling and helping people build their business case has been very important. And then finally, producing offer documents that go to the community, that explain to them very simply, communicate very simply the ideas, what the purpose is and what they're buying into and what risk they are taking. So simple and transparent communications. This next slide is just explaining a little bit about the handbook. It's one of my tasks falls on me is to write the handbook. I mean, it's also worth noting, you can see this, if your English is good, you can go to a website, it's open source. In Australia, they have just produced an Australian version of the Community Shares Handbook. That's the first other country that we know of to adopt very similar practices. And they have produced an Australian law version of this. This is a quick slide just introducing you to our new standards mark. And we are now preparing to take the next step, which is to get international standard ISO certification body status for this mark. We've been training professional practitioners. So far we have a cohort of 100 practitioners, of whom 20 have now in the last year passed through the licensing process. Throughout all of this, we've also been operating a crowdfunding site. We set this up for research and development processes so we could understand and get data about who the investors were. We have now closed it down and given the space over to commercial operators. There are two other crowdfunding sites that promote community shares, one called Crowdfunder, the other called Ethics. And that's it really. If you're interested and want to find out more, can I strongly recommend that you have a look at our website, the communityshares.org.uk. These are some publications here about this, the handbook. Investing in Community Shares is a book that's aimed at the public, and then we produce market reports each year. The most recent one is the 2015. 2016 will come out towards the end of the year. If you want to get in touch with me, please feel free to email me. As a strategic advisor, I'm independent of the Unit 2, and I have my own website and a development practice called Baker Brown Associates. Also, if you want to follow us on Twitter, or if you want to learn, actually one good way of learning more about community shares is to go to YouTube. There is over 100 videos made by local groups about their own enterprises and how they did it. So if you want to find out how pubs, bakeries, nurseries, all sorts of different types of projects have done it, I suggest you have a look at YouTube. Thank you very much.